We are recording just in case we have some great conversation. We need to catch it.
Yeah. Epic Voices and Conversations podcast. Yeah. All right.
I'm going to say that.
So do you remember the breakdown that I kind of laid out that we should do?
Let me put on my voice.
Welcome to the Epic Voices and Conversations podcast, giving you, the listener, the opportunity to experience, engage, explore, and sometimes share stories of energy, passion, inspiration, and connectedness. We are your hosts, Raquel Buchanan
and Dave Matthews. Our real jobs between doing these podcasts are being mental health providers, therapists, and group facilitators, working with people whose issues are related to high stress, trauma, violent behavior, and intimate partner or family violence.
As a part of providing trauma-informed care, we intend for these podcasts to inspire professionals working with children, youth, and adults who have experienced trauma or violence some hope and support to build self-awareness, increase professional self-care strategies, and to help in developing resilience while doing the work in the field.
The Epic Voices and Conversations podcast is brought to you by 1T Productions.
Are you ready for some interesting conversations, stimulating considerations, and hearing passionate voices?
Epic Voices and Conversations podcast, pre-episode, Origins of Epic Voices and Conversations.
During this episode, the creator of the Epic Moments interview and co-host of this show, Dave Matthews, will be introducing the Epic Moments interview, a mindfulness-based technique that has helped many people find inspiration, build resilience, and practice self-care. Dave Matthews and I will give some more information about ourselves and share some of our experiences in the fields that we work.
I'm excited to share this interview format. I've created it and use it to work with people that I work with who've experienced trauma or violence to help them to ignite energy, spark passion, find inspiration, and build connectedness.
Hey, Dave. I can't wait to share with our listeners what the Epic Voices and Conversations podcast is really about. I bet our audience would love to know a little bit more about who the heck they're listening to. And I really can't wait to share my own epic moments.
Thanks, Raquel. Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll start if that's okay.
Absolutely. Mainly because that's what the script says.
Got it. I'll do my best to summarize things, although anyone enduring my trainings know I can go on. So please excuse the long background summary. I'm pretty old, you know.
You're like a fine wine, Dave. You get better with age.
Beautiful. First, let me give you a little bit of my background in terms of the work that I've done in the field of trauma, violence, intimate partner violence, family violence, and violence prevention, which has gone on for over 35 years now. I've been blessed and honored to have been provided a lot of guidance and learning and supervision by some amazing professionals in my life, colleagues, historical cornerstones of the work, vast numbers of women who were victim survivors, men who've been abusive to their partners, and the work that they've done in their lives, and countless numbers of children and youth who've been witnesses or victim survivors of trauma or violence in the home. I want to pay honor to all of them and express my appreciation for them and to them. Without these people, without these influences, without these people that I've had opportunity to work with, to hear from, to listen to learn from, I know I would not be here today. It's on their shoulders of these people that I stand. For 35 years, I've been specifically working in the field of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. I currently am a therapist at a place called Family Life Mental Health Center at People Incorporated in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities. I facilitate a men's domestic abuse group, an anger management group, and a mother's restorative parenting group, as well as provide individual therapy for folks and family therapy for folks where violence and trauma are the main issues. My main focus with those folks is on trauma and their experience of interpersonal violence. In addition, I'm a community faculty at the Minnesota Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, and I've taught classes there for almost 13 years. Usually I teach adolescent psychology in the psychology department and a class on violence, origins and explanations in the human services department. I've been in private practice, or I had been in private practice for about 28 years as a therapist, presenter, trainer, consultant, court expert witness, producer of media materials, and consultant on issues related to intimate partner violence, community violence, parenting, and violence prevention. In many of these positions, I've had the chance to create and develop programs, services to address trauma and violence related to issues or experiences of it. And in addition, I've led, co-led, or participated in multiple initiatives, community action teams, collaborations, and committees for eliminating, reducing, or preventing violence in families. Whew, well, enough about me for now. How about you, Raquel?
I am a licensed therapist in Palm Springs, California. It's really a beautiful place. I've officially been in the field since 2011, but I jumped at the opportunity to do peer counseling in 2006 through an elective and technical course offered at my high school. And that's where I received my first certificate to use anger management techniques. Having this early experience is an important part of my work because it shows that when you know what you want to do, you know. Throughout the years, I've really enjoyed helping victims of childhood abuse regain their sense of power and build their self-esteem. I was the clinical director at a nonprofit agency that provided non-traditional therapies like art-based therapy, pet-assisted therapies, and drama therapies to families affected by sexual abuse. I've always had an interest in working with difficult clients and individuals who are more severely impacted by their mental illness. I have worked in intensive outpatient treatment settings and have volunteered countless hours in special education classrooms with children impacted by developmental disabilities. Interestingly enough, trauma was a globalized experience in each of these populations. Early on, I knew that the prevention of violence and abuse wasn't going to happen by working with the victims alone. So I made the decision to focus my efforts on assisting people who use violence. I became a group facilitator for court-ordered therapy, and I continue to do individual therapy with clients who want to stop their use of violence. Working with batterers and perpetrators, which we really shouldn't call them, has been the most rewarding for me because in healing, you begin to see the change of personal narratives. It's astonishing the way that we talk about ourselves. I love this field, and I'm really excited to learn. I can clearly see how people can work together to establish a common goal. I'm looking to do something epic.
Yeah, terrific. And you know, some of the things that you relate to really spawned some thoughts for me about my hope about having some conversations about particularly some of those points that you raised.
Dave, let's get into it. Where does the story of epic moments begin?
Well, there are two primary roots, as I call them, to the epic moments approach. The first is a base of where this all came from. The first is the actual clinical work that I've done and changes in my thinking and approach over the years for how we work with men who batter or those who have been abusive or hurtful to their intimate partners. And I use that phrase often for that traditional phrase of when we talk about perpetrators of domestic abuse or men who batter. The phrase I try to work with is those who've been abusive or hurtful to their intimate partners. It's a little longer, but I think it really covers, and it's a lot more respectful in terms of who we're talking about and how we talk about them. In any case, the second root, though, to understanding epic moments really comes from what I call these 5 components of trauma-informed care.
Dave, would you mind sharing with our listeners what these 5 components of trauma-informed care are?
Absolutely. I think This is critical to, I think, anybody's professional approach with children, with adults who've experienced some sort of high stress or some sort of trauma, that we understand that whether we're a therapist or whether we're a school educator, who might be in the medical field, that we really need to have these particular things in mind, these 5 components in mind. So basically, the 5 components of providing trauma-informed care as an individual professional include: 1, knowledge and understanding of the way in which trauma affects the brain, human development, and as many of the actual physiological workings as possible. So really having a good knowledge base of the functioning of trauma, its effects on the body and on the brain. Secondly, a second component is knowledge and cultural proficiency of the people I'm working with and how trauma uniquely might interact with and affect these people. So this is about paying attention to their experiences of trauma from their particular frame of reference and their background, and how whatever group it is that might be different than the community that I'm from may have experienced some sort of trauma, both historical as well as community, and as well as how it affects them developmentally in their unique ways from whatever culture that they're coming from. Third is the ability to develop methods and interventions and strategies for using this information when I'm working with the people that I work with. So it's not just having this knowledge of how trauma works, and even not just being culturally proficient in terms of understanding who the person is that I'm working with. It's also about then how do I use that information with that person within the time that I'm have contact with that person. Fourth is this ability to pass on then and assist people that I work with the strategies to implement and integrate into their lives to help them to address their own trauma, their own experience of stress. So this is about helping them to develop their own methods, their own strategies, their own techniques of mindfulness, of self-care strategies. And then the fifth component here is this whole necessary part, and sometimes we forget this one, but hopefully more and more professionals are paying attention to it, and that's about professional care. That's about what do we need to do to take care of ourselves. The phrase that I often come back to is that when somebody shares their trauma with me, it becomes my trauma. And I need to figure out, how do I take care of myself now that I've taken on this other trauma that somebody has shared with me. And when we're in positions and as professionals, constantly taking in other people's stories, other people's experiences of trauma, we can feel pretty overloaded. And so we need to find ways to reduce the chance of burnout, reduce the chance of secondary trauma, or compassion fatigue, as it's sometimes called, and find those places that we need to apply the mindfulness techniques to ourselves. So in terms of the Epic Moments, then, Epic Moments is both for helping the people that we work with, but it's also applicable to helping us as professionals to apply to ourselves.
I am really interested in hearing more about your clinical work and your experience and this commitment to trauma-informed care that led you to develop the Epic Moments interview. Could you share a little bit more about that route?
Absolutely. That goes back to that experience, those years of working particularly with men who were hurtful towards their intimate partners. And I was trained early on, many years ago, wow, back in the middle 80s. That's the 1980s, by the way, not the 1880s. And I went through many of those trainings that were going on back then when I stepped into this whole field of violence and domestic abuse, including the Duluth Abuse Intervention Program model. At that time, I was working in the Twin Cities at a program that started its men's services and even either at the same time or slightly after the Duluth Abuse Intervention Program had developed their model. So I was working as a group facilitator for men's domestic abuse groups, women's survivor groups, children's and adolescent groups, and youth who witnessed or were direct victims of violence in the home. So I was one of probably about 15 staff, and we were each doing all these groups. We each were doing a couple men's groups. We were doing at least one women's group and several children's groups and adolescent groups. So it was, for me, it was 14 years of group training and work within that kind of context, which was very exciting and very helpful for me to kind of lay this foundation for myself. Again, while all the staff had experienced the training of the Duluth Abuse Intervention Program model for working with men, because we as a staff were licensed therapists, we had used some of these pieces of that model and combined it for a while with some of the therapeutic approaches. Of course, this is how it happens all the time now, that we take different trainings, we take different approaches, and we find ways to mold them and shape them to the context in which we're providing those services. So, we were doing that back then in terms of being able to really adjust and address the issues of domestic abuse and using hurtful behaviors with the men in the context of the way that we could provide that as therapists, right? So for the last 34 years of doing this work, particularly with men, it has been seemingly obvious we needed to approach this issue of abusive behavior from a more holistic perspective. Of course, we must still include in programs the gender violence perspective that emphasizes also accountability for one's abusive behavior or hurtful behavior toward an intimate partner, as well as to take now what we now know about brain physiology, functioning, and human development, and the use of well-established best practices of therapeutic approaches, such as cognitive behavioral therapy, social learning theory, attachment theory, and feminist theory. So we really had to kind of pay attention to this, and things have really evolved over time, and certainly have evolved for me in terms of the way in which I'm doing these men's groups now. As I've grown older, I've seen it's important to me to have a clear understanding of how I answer the question, what is my theory of change?
That is a great question to ask, and a very great question for our listeners to reflect on as we work with individuals who have been traumatized.
Absolutely. And so with the aforementioned theories and approaches, along with the research knowledge that the glue or woven element that truly brings about change is really relationship, right? This factor, regardless of the approach or theory, is what we know to be the most activating element to bring about change. This has been shown in research over and over again to be true. And sometimes in the past, relationship has been dismissed. Relationship has been minimized or has been said to be, well, if you build a relationship with particularly these men who've been hurtful or abusive towards their partners, heavens, you don't want to join with them about their behaviors. That's not what this is about. Those kinds of ways of falling into somehow communicating that it's okay for them to use abusive behaviors, that's not what building a relationship's about in a way that will help you to help them to make different choices in their life, right? Because relationship is the basis of it. It's not about agreeing with their behaviors and saying that their behaviors were okay. And it's my belief that, and it's possible because I see it almost every day, and I think I see it in many other people who are doing this work, is that there's a balance. There's a balance between the compassion, support kind of approach alongside the whole withholding people accountable for their own behaviors, and that the two can coincide, the two can coexist, and the two actually need to be in balance rather than to be overweighted on one side or the other, right?
It's important to note that when someone shares their experience, that does not directly mean that they are not taking accountability.
That's exactly correct. And our response of being able to say, I get it. That makes sense. That explains what brings you to that choice of making that, doing that behavior. Again, it does not mean that they're not accountable for that behavior, right? It does not mean it's an excuse for that behavior, but for us to have a better understanding and to let them know that they can understand what brought them to that choice helps them to make better choices in the future.
I think the golden rule that has helped for me in working with this population is remembering that hurt people hurt people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great phrase, isn't it? That's a
Yes.
great phrase. I really like that one as well. That's a terrific one.
So let's get back to this idea about trauma and trauma-informed care working with individuals who use violence or people who are exposed to violence. Tell me a little bit more about the second route, what you've taken from your knowledge on trauma-informed care.
Sure. So over the years, and particularly recently, one of the more common, if not essential elements of doing any work with people is to be trauma informed, right? I mean, that's become a buzzword, and just about you can't read a grant that doesn't require some sort of attention that needs to be written about how you're going to be trauma informed. Well, in fact, this term has taken on a life of its own, right? Long story short, it's my belief that we need to provide trauma-informed care. And some people are adding on resiliency kinds of work as well. Again, here's another kind of balanced kind of way we have to look at things. It's not just looking at trauma, it's also looking at resiliency pieces as well. But trauma-informed care really is the term that I'm trying to use more so than just leave it at trauma-informed. And regardless of what the professional work we do with people, again, whether it's medical, in the medical field, or whether it's in the education field, or it's in doing therapy or counseling, that we need to see that we can provide trauma-informed care in whatever kind of professional life we're in. So I've now developed a way to view that what this term means and use those 5 components of trauma-informed care to more fully assess whether I or someone else is actually providing that trauma-informed care or not. Epic moments comes from knowing how the brain works when stressed or has been traumatized, understanding the people or person I'm working with, and how trauma or stress is particularly being experienced by these people. Being able to use epic moments while providing the services I do with this person, helping this person learn the epic moments, process, and when and how to apply it in situations, and then to use it myself as a way for me to do my own self-care. Now that includes all 5 of those components in that work using epic moments.
It sounds like so much of this approach is based on the understanding of how the brain works and how it functions when we're under chronic stress.
Absolutely, and that's something that in terms of everything from how we talk to men in the groups about what they do, not just about getting away. For many years, our go-to response was really, well, get away, just leave the situation. But that's only half the answer, really. And I think knowing what we know about brain functioning now, we need to really pay attention to that, and then how we help men apply that in those situations. So as we know so much about the brain and what happens to the brain under stress, it's important for our batters programs and people that work with people who've been abusive to their intimate partners to figure out how to integrate this knowledge into programming. Many of the programs that are education based, for instance, may have difficulty in figuring this one out because many times those education programs are not wanting to do therapy, right? They're not wanting to do that sort of thing.
I would definitely have to agree with you. We are asking individuals to make logical decisions and choices when they are emotionally flooded, when that area of their brain has shut down and they're unable to access logical higher order functioning and thought.
And we have to pay attention to that element of it, even though we also do need to talk, and we need to balance that out also with discussion of gender violence and what's that, the gender-based violence kinds of factors that are involved. Just to mention again that there have been, because of this understanding of the brain and how it affects our choices and the effects of stress on our brain, and when we're in those moments, it has some huge implications for the programs that have been educational in the past and not delved into other or have not started to include or to take on other understandings of how the brain functions, even over this past 20 years. This does not mean accountability, gender violence focus, and oppression and patriarchy are abandoned or minimized. It does not mean adjusting programming towards being more of a medical model approach. And unfortunately, some people want to tack that name onto this and any sort of therapeutic approach as a medical model kind of approach, especially when you're from Minnesota, because a lot of people want to talk about the medical model when we come out of Minnesota, and if it's not from the other educational programming that goes on here. But it is not, when we're taking this approach in terms of paying attention to the brain, this is not a medical model. This is, in fact, the medical model needs to take on a more trauma-informed approach in terms of understanding things. So one major example of an adjustment that needs to be done really has to do with that programming for men who've been abusive in their relationships with partners. And what we know about brain functioning then, stressed is fully understanding the neurochemistry and coping mechanisms that kick in when experiencing stress. It's now well researched and understood that when the limbic system receives information about being stressed, the cortisol neurochemical is released, which then sends the message to the rest of the brain and other parts of the body to survive that stress. As a result, there are actually 5 stress reactions that are potentially used to cope and survive the stress: our fight, flight, freeze, fold, and flock. Many of us have already heard probably about fight and flight as ways some people cope with the experience of stress, where when somebody is experiencing stress or high anxiety or major difficulty in kind of, and where they're stuck in their midbrain, in this part of the brain, they may react to try to cope with that stress by fighting back, by being aggressive back. Some might use some sort of flight, trying to get away. But also flight can be seen by way of getting away from stress by using drugs or drinking, or by choices about other coping mechanisms, using tobacco. And then there is freeze. And this is where someone becomes stuck, almost literally unable to move when they feel stressed, and that's their reaction initially. Then there is fold, where the person who's stressed, the brain is registering overload and is incapable of surviving the stress unless the brain disengages from the body and other parts of the mind. This is where sometimes we use the term disassociation, which is a valid term. It's valid as well as an important coping mechanism. You know, I often tell my students that within whatever number of hours that I'm providing some sort of training or some sort of lecture, likely it is they're going to disassociate from my talking. So it's a reasonable coping mechanism to deal with things when we're under stress. And again, this is about being able to survive the stress, right? Then there is this 5th stress reaction, which is called flocking, to flock. When some experience stress, they seek out others to connect with, to validate the experience or their reality in order to cope or survive the stress. Back in our cave people days, this is how our ancestors survived, by being in groups and connecting with others. You know, stress and trauma leads to a sense of isolation. And flocking leads to another chemical in the brain being released, and that is oxytocin. So this is the reaction When we connect and when we appropriately and positively connect with somebody else, that's when the oxytocin gets released. And when oxytocin is released, it gives a sense of calm, peacefulness, safety, and security. So it's not the same response that we get when dopamine is released, which gives us more of a heightened excitement and more of a, this is really about relaxation. This is really about a sense of peace and safety that when oxytocin is released. It is the counterbalance to cortisol, which is that stress chemical. This does help us to understand what is going on in somebody's brain when they are stressed, and that they will lean towards it. It's always a choice what they decide to do, but this is what helps to lead to and influences that choice. So when we talk with men about taking a time out, it's not just about isolating themselves so they don't cause more hurt or abuse, so that they don't cause more hurt or abuse. It is important to find ways to flock appropriately so as to release oxytocin. The other part of the answer is about what do they need to do to connect in order to counteract the cortisol.
How does the Epic Moments interview take into account trauma-informed care, and how does it help us with these natural stress responses?
This Epic Moments strategy or mindfulness technique is based in understanding the science. And ignoring the science and continuing to do the programming without it does not benefit those people we work with. And by the way, the stress response in our brains and possible antidote is true not just for adult men, but also for children, youth, and parents, and other adults. The word EPIC is an acronym, of course, and I'm unashamed of acronyms and alliterations, as many people will learn throughout these times. But EPIC does stand for, E is for energy, P is for passion, I is for inspiration, and C is for connections. The idea here, essentially the tool that I'm suggesting people use and people keep coming back to in their own heads, is to make lists of each of these areas of energy, passion, inspiration, and connections so that they can bring it back into their minds, which then will help them to release oxytocin. Because we know that there are different ways in which to release oxytocin. One is by physical, warm, appropriate, mutual, wanted touch. Another way to release oxytocin is by way of having a conversation and an interaction with another person that feels meaningful and safe and secure. Another way to release oxytocin is by way of being in the presence of somebody that we feel safe and secure with. A fourth way is to be mindful of somebody that we feel close and connected to. A fifth way is to use prayer or use meditation to feel connected with a higher power or a higher being or a greater, bigger piece of the world. And then the sixth way that's been probably researched a little bit has been about having a pet, having a dog or a cat, in terms of, and this is where we get a lot of our understanding of using support animals or therapy animals as ways to help clients to connect and to feel, and then that release of oxytocin happens. So if we go back to paying attention to what we think about, and that's what these lists of epic moments are about. Having these epic lists of things that we can think about in those moments when we are stressed. And the Epic Moments interview is really guided by a series of questions used to stimulate thinking, discussion, and to gain some self-awareness. So, you ready for this, Raquel?
Let's do this.
Okay. So let's start. So tell me, Raquel, what gives you energy?
What gives me energy is definitely music. Music has the ability to change my mood, and I love singing in the car. I think a lot of people are energized by music, and I know that a lot of the people I work with also use music to cope. In sessions, I often find that me and my clients are having full-on conversations using song lyrics.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, and let's keep going. So tell me things that you are passionate about, things that make you feel passionate or that you feel very strongly about.
What ignites my passion is visualizing myself as a child and keeping that youthful passion alive for her.
Mm.
In fact, I keep pictures of myself as a child to remind myself of how far I've come. I want to be the best version of myself. So what gives me passion is reflecting on my life experience and learning from them.
Beautiful. That's terrific. That's a great image. So, what about inspiration? What words have you used to inspire yourself? What phrases, what quotes, or what inspirational moments have you had? I've had some people who talked about, their first concert that they ever went to, or their first rock concert. Well, rock concert, whatever concert, live concert that they went to was inspirational for them, or something somebody said at a speech. What is your inspiration?
What inspires me is you, everyone out there listening,
Yeah.
and the people not listening. Other people are a great source of inspiration for me. I'm pretty extroverted in that sense, and I love helping others. But in particular, a cause that really inspires me is advocacy for individuals with developmental disabilities and assisting them to find their voice. When I think about inspiration, I automatically think about my brother and all of his friends throughout the years. Specifically, I remember one of my brother's peers. His name was Patrick. Patrick was about 6 foot tall and had autism and was unable to speak. But every time I walked into my brother's classroom, Patrick would light up and begin to communicate with me in the best way he knew how, which was a combination of groans. When I think about what inspires me, I reflect on documentaries like Crip Camp, and it shows the firsthand experience of people with differences who have faced adversity. Fighting through adversity is what really inspires me.
Wow, wow. You see, and just in you having shared that to me is inspiring. That's really, I think, something important, an important concept to understand about this process, is that this is about our own self awareness of what works for us. But when we share it with other people, it becomes their victory, their triumph, their inspiration as well. So that's terrific. And so finally, we went through energy, we went through passion, we talked about your inspiration. What about those people you feel connected to, specific people that you felt safe or secure with, or people you can think of that you felt some sort of special connection with in your life?
When I think about being connected to others and the connections that I've made, I think about my family, friends, and colleagues. First is Wayne Brazil. He's a former supervisor and mentor. He is really a role model to me and is a true Renaissance man. He's a therapist, fine artist, writer, and researcher. I actually have several of his paintings in my house, and I like to look at those to feel connected to him. He is someone who has taught me to not box myself in and has shown me that I can be successful while keeping true to myself. Then I think about my brother James, who has autism and is blind. He is someone who has taught me about compassion, patience, and understanding. When you grow up watching someone who has been given limitations and see them overcome those limitations, you know that anything is possible. And it reminds me that I always have so much to be grateful for. There's my higher power, a connection to something bigger and greater than myself. Reminding myself that there's something out there that is bigger than me reminds me that I have purpose.
That's perfect. That's perfect. So here we've gone through these pieces. We've gone through all four of these lists for you. And again, we can keep adding lists as we go along for ourselves. Things that, because, and one other thing that I recognize is that initially when I have people go through this process, they kind of have a hard time coming up with the first one or two. But once we can start digging a little bit into the ground around some of these, whether it's energy or passion, inspiration, or connections, it seems like sometimes those floodgates of just more memories of other things. Oh yeah, this is what I'm inspired by. Yeah, this is what I get energy by. Oh, I am really passionate about this. And oh, that's right, I remember that third grade teacher I had. That is what really, again, those memories then are what we want to access when we're in that dysregulated state, so that we can disengage from that place and become more regulated to hopefully make more positive and better decisions.
Dave, I also heard that you offer trainings on the Epic Moments interview so that other mental health professionals can use this method.
Yeah, I do indeed provide both consultation and training to implement this tool with the people that these professionals might work with. But I also do some of that training or some of that consultation with professionals themselves as a way for us to, as professionals, not to get burnt out or to avoid burnout or to not get too caught up in any compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. Would you mind helping me to do my own epic moments?
Absolutely. I'd love to give it a try.
All right.
The Epic Moments interview is about energy, passion, inspiration, and connectedness. Dave, what are some activities or experiences that bring you energy to continue your work in this field?
Well, just as you said, music is a big part of my life. And I find that, my playlists from different singers, songwriters, is where I go to get my energy. And when I'm doing my walking, this is the playlist that I go to in terms of hearing from people such as Cat Stevens, oh my, Jim Croce, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and just going to all these places, James Taylor, that these songs that really kind of help to kind of both the melodies as well as some of the lyrics, just are really at the base of kind of giving me some get up and go to really kind of move forward. One other thing that gives me energy as well is being around driven people, and you talked about that as well, and about people who do the work and are hearing, and my being able to hear about their experiences and feeling the passion that they have for doing this work. That also gives me gas to kind of move forward in doing things.
So we went through your energy. What about passion? Are there any causes that ignite passion within yourself or something that you're passionate about?
You know, I find that a lot of my passion is really kind of is in some ways very context related, and context based in terms of the work that I do. I truly am. It might sound kind of geeky to say this, but I truly am trauma care with everyone, but particularly thinking about it, trauma care with youth and children. And of course, thinking about the flip side of trauma care, which I think is something that we're still trying. I think most of us as professionals are trying to use to balance out not just the focus on the trauma, but to also think about the resiliency and think about post-traumatic growth. So, in addition to those things, I'm also passionate about men's issues and about self-care.
How do you find inspiration in your daily life? What comes to mind when you think about inspiration? Is there anything that you may visualize or use to stimulate your thinking, maybe motivate you?
Absolutely. There's a whole list of people, both who are living, who are not living, famous people that I've read on, people that I've watched in the media that just have been so inspirational to me. I mean, they'd never know it, of course, but their work and their lives have just kind of helped me to kind of think about mine and to be inspired to do the work that I'm doing. Everybody from people like Michelle Obama, President Obama, as well as people much more personal to me. I had a history teacher in high school, and I don't know that he really remembers, or he would remember, how much he really meant to me and how much he inspired me. He really gave me kind of a sense of okayness about who I was and about having differing beliefs and being able to kind of get my thoughts out there. He was very supportive in that way. It was very inspiring in terms of how he put forward his thoughts and how he felt about me. He's somebody that I relate back to quite a bit in terms of being inspired by.
Connectedness is so important.
Mhm.
Is there anybody in your life who has been particularly important to your work, or maybe someone who has offered you compassion or helped you out in a time of need?
Absolutely, absolutely, and and some people again who wouldn't recognize that they were actually the providers of that sense of compassion or that they realized that my connection with them was really all that important, probably. And something as mundane as a dentist I had once who was very was very significant in my life in terms of understanding what it meant to feel compassion. And there's a whole story behind that, of course, but also in terms of other colleagues and people that I have so much appreciated their friendship and their guidance. Researchers and other professors and executive directors of different agencies and organizations that have that I that I felt honored to be having some sort of even conversation with. And so there are some very specific people. I mentioned before. I think back to my connections with my history teacher, Mr. Rivkin. He was really something. I also have had some very positive other teachers, and colleagues. I mean, there's some colleagues. I'll drop some names here. Dr. Oliver Williams, for one, who's been very instrumental in my my learning and has been a good friend of mine over the years. I've also had a number of other folks, again, colleagues that I've worked with that have been very helpful. Aaron Milgram, and some other personal associates and colleagues. Those connections then, those are the connections that I bring back to mind to help me in those times that really I need those oxytocin levels to rise, because those connections just being brought back to mind help to do that and help to counterbalance any stress that I might be experiencing.
As I'm sitting here listening to you respond, I am automatically filled with a flood of memories and a flood of positive thoughts about people, places, and things who have helped me continue over the years. Mm-hmm. And when you're saying that one leads to another, you are so right. Getting myself in a mindset of resiliency, of compassion, of releasing that oxytocin. Mm-hmm. I've definitely experienced that in doing this Epic Moments interview.
Well, good. I'm glad it's working. I'm glad it's working for you.
Wow, what an epic experience. As a person who works with individuals who have experienced trauma or violence, I'm always looking for new ways to build resilience. The Epic Moments interview is going to be so helpful, Dave. I'd really like to see if we could get some other people on our show to share their epic moments.
That is a terrific idea, Raquel. Absolutely. And as a matter of fact, right, we're moving in that direction. We can make that happen. We'll be engaging with not just other professionals, but with other movements and other groups.
If you are interested in sharing your own epic moments, send an email to EVACPodcast@gmail.com. This has been the Epic Voices and Conversations podcast. We intend for these podcasts to provide professionals working with people who have experienced trauma or violence some hope and support to build self-awareness, increase professional self-care strategies, and to help in developing resilience while doing the work in the field.
We look forward to releasing the next episode in the series of this set of podcasts soon.
For the Epic Voices and Conversations podcast, this is Raquel Buchanan and
Dave Matthews. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you find ways to focus on your own self-care and your own epic moments. Till next time.